Hello, everyone. My name is Luis Manela Pereira, and I will be talking about my paper on the impact of the embedding process on network resilience quantification, which I worked on and wrote together with Dr. Iyengar and Dr. Amini. Studying network resilience is crucial to ensure the reliability and security of critical infrastructures. Studying resilience also helps us prevent major issues such as cascading failures that lead to massive rolling blackouts. A good example of cascading failure would be the blackout of 2003 in Italy, which lasted a bit over half a day and affected roughly around 56 million people. So far from what we have seen, studying network resilience has been limited to graph theoretical methods. For example, many papers use degree centrality to create a resilience metric. Now, degree centrality is a concept from graph theory that looks only at the number of edges incident to a node in order to help develop this resilience metric. So again, strictly graph theoretical. In my previous paper called Topological Data Analysis for Network Resilience Quantification, I introduced a new way to quantify network resilience that instead of using graph theory, it utilizes topological data analysis, also known as TDA, and computational topology. In that paper, we used an abstract network so that the outcome of the paper was in fact a framework that other researchers could use in their respective fields to compute resilience. At the time of writing that paper, I had only really found one other research paper that did something similar to what I intended to do. The difference, though, was that they used an embedding process, whereas in my paper, I didn't use one. And at the time, I had hypothesized that using an embedding could actually affect the resilience metric. So after I finished that, I went on to look and test that hypothesis, and that's what led to this paper. There are a few moving parts to the project, so I think it's best that we first take a broad view of what's happening here. Here we have a high-level overview of how the resilience quantification process works. We begin by first creating a network. Now, this could either be some random design or some network architecture you're considering in your respective field. And once you have that design done, then you need to ask yourself, do I want to impose a metric space? Meaning, do I want to use an embedding process or not? And we're going to see how this impacts the results a little later in the presentation. But for now, I just want you to keep in mind that there is a reason why we would choose one over the other and vice versa. So let's say that we don't want to choose an embedding, meaning we go to the right, the arrow to the right of the no arrow. This means that we're going to need to choose some real value weights to be associated with each edge. These are also known as edge features. And these weights would obviously be different depending on the field you're working on. For example, if you work in the realm of networking, so internet networks, we can think of weights as the limitation on how much data can be transferred over each wire. But now let's consider choosing an embedding, meaning that we want to impose a metric space. We're going to go and follow the yes arrow pointing downward here on the left. We then need to choose how to perform the embedding. That would be the next question. Now, the embedding essentially gives us some points in some type of space, which we will then need to compute some pairwise distances. And then we take these pairwise distances as inputs to the next step, which is we're actually going to be looking at an example in the coming slides about the embedding process and what we mean by subspace. In our paper, we use something called the WEGO framework to compute the embeddings. WEGO stands for Wasserstein embeddings for graph learning, and I will be talking about it more in the coming slides. But regardless of whether you choose yes or no, you take the right or the downward path, um, they both eventually lead to the creation of something called a Vietoris-Rips complex or a VR complex. And those are then inputs into creating persistent diagrams. In the previous slide, I talked a bit about the embedding process, but I did not give specifics about what that meant. Um, Here we're going to talk a little bit more about this process. When I was reading the literature relevant to my prior research, I only found one paper that did something similar to what we wanted to do. And that paper was about power grids. And they did use an embedding. Um, and that embedding took their network and embedded it into a Euclidean space in a way that the distance between any 2 points or the nodes of the networks um, were related to the transmission rate of electricity between any two nodes. Here in this research project, we instead chose to use the Lego framework, which gave more abstraction and let us use more information about the network. For example, the Wegel framework requires us to give both um, weights or information about the network to the edges and the nodes, meaning not only do we have edge features, but we also have node features. Furthermore, the Wegel embeddings are embeddings into a Hilbert space, which are, again, another level of abstraction. They are more abstract than Euclidean spaces. The Wegel framework is to perform graph embeddings. The whole job and the whole end outcome of this process is a vector valued embedding. Um, that network embedding, that vector embedding, is then going to be fed to some other model to perform some type of action, such as classifications. Now, the model works like this. We begin first by taking a graph and performing some form of local feature aggregation. At the end of this feature aggregation process, you have features that represent each node, right? Node features. We then perform some general pooling process. For example, we can use something like the average pooling process. After these steps have created what we call a node embedding. So after we perform the general pooling process or the average pooling process, we end up with something called the node embedding. And the next step is to compute something called the Monge maps between the reference distribution and the node embeddings that we just computed. Monge maps are essentially mappings between two distributions such that the cost to move mass from distribution 1 to distribution 2 is minimal. In order to stay away from the deep and complex mathematics and just convey the general idea, I'll just leave it at that definition. But I recommend anyone that's interested to read the paper or look up optimal transport. It's a very rich field that's coming up in machine learning. So what's interesting is that Kalorian and his fellow researchers in their paper, the Wasserstein embedding for graph learning, showed that the choice for the reference distribution is actually inconsequential, meaning that if you choose a uniform distribution or a Gaussian distribution, the end result ends up being the same. So since they chose to use a Gaussian distribution, we just simply stuck with the heuristics and decided to do the same. And the last thing is the transport displacements that are created by that last step are actually the embeddings that we have thus far. So if you look all the way to the right-hand side, those vectors, that is what we attained from the Wegel framework, and those are the embeddings of our network, the original graph all the way on the left-hand side. And these embeddings are the vector representations or the points in some space that we talked about, which are then fed into the rest of the workflow that we previously covered. Now that we have an idea of the general workflow and a little general idea of the math behind the research, let's look at how the simulation was designed so that we can quantify resilience and make comparisons between the results of whether to choose an embedding or not to choose an embedding. So we start with a complete graph, like the image on the top right-hand side here. We then begin to remove edges one at a time until we have removed all of the edges. The image on the bottom right-hand side and is just an example of a subgraph after removing a certain number of edges. Next, we decide whether we're going to make an embedding or not. So let's continue down the no embedding path. We then require that the edges have some real value or weights assigned to them. And with these weights, we compute the VR complex, then followed by generating the persistence diagrams. The next step would be to take these diagrams, one for the complete graph and all of the other subgraphs, and compute the W distance or the Wasserstein distance, which is a distance metric that falls under the umbrella of optimal transport. We then take the inverse of those distances, which tells us essentially what the resilience level is what we call the resilience metric. And what that resilience metric is, it's essentially a percentage of the resilience of the complete graph. Now, the reason why we choose to use a complete graph as a base case is because it has so many redundant connections that it essentially has the least likelihood of some sort of catastrophic failure, such as cascading failures. And now that we have this resilience quantified for this no embedding choice process, we are going to repeat the same algorithm, but instead choosing now to perform the embedding. This means that we use the same complete graph and the same subgraphs, but instead we're going to need to give weights to both the nodes and the edges, which are real valued weights, or the node features and the edge features. These weights are essentially samples generated from a normal distribution. The reason why we did it this way is we didn't want the experiment to sort of favor or have bias to a specific field. We wanted it to be instead a general framework for other researchers to use in their field. So now that we have the node and the edge features assigned, we utilize the WEGO framework to obtain the vector embeddings. And then we use with those vector embeddings, we compute pairwise distance between all of the points that was generated. And we use those distances to compute the VR complex for each graph and subgraph, as we have done before, which are then fed into and used to generate the persistence diagrams. And the last step is essentially to compute the W distance to the diagram of the complete graph, as we have done before, and taking the inverse to compute the resilience metric. Then once we have all of those resilience levels computed, we're going to plot and compare the results of both methods. The results are actually quite interesting. Although we expected to see a difference, we did not precisely expect what happened to happen. But actually we found it pretty easy to reason out why that came to happen. The first thing that we saw was that the persistence diagrams showed more information was carried about a network when we used the WEGO embedding process. These were shown as more points for both homology classes 0 and 1 in the persistence diagrams. Now, this behavior is in line with the hypothesis that different mechanism would inherently carry different amount of information about a network, or types of information about a network, which would again affect the resilience metric, which again was the original hypothesis. The one interesting result that we observed was that using the embedding process led to carrying out more information about the network throughout the entire resilience quantification process, and it led to smoother drop-offs in resilience as we removed each edge. Now we can see this as this representation as the blue line of the graph on the right-hand side. The abstract method, on the other hand, the one that doesn't use an embedding, actually has fewer but more drastic changes in resilience, which you can see as the gray line. Um, Now, this could also be explained by one of the fundamental theories behind TDA, which says that topological data analysis methods um, does a better job than other methods in dealing with noise or noisy data. Now, what does this mean in this context? It means that the abstract method is considering small changes in the architecture to be noise, but finds that removing some critical edges to be very meaningful changes. And we see those reflected in the resilience level. Like we have very large drop off when we take out certain number of edges. Now, we can easily conclude that using an embedding plays a different role than not using one. If someone were, if someone is looking to define the critical edges of their network, then they should choose to use the abstract framework to quantify resilience. Whereas if they wanted to see the progressive changes in the resilience level of their network as they manipulate the architecture, they should instead choose to use the embedding route. So this takes us back to early on in the presentation when I said that making the decision actually has an impact. This is how that plays out. The last thing I want to talk about is some ideas that we have for potential future work. Although we were very happy with the results that we got, and impressed with some of the results that we didn't expect, but found to be very interesting and meaningful. Um, there are still some interesting questions to be answered. For example, we would like to apply the methods to critical infrastructure data. But this data is extremely sensitive data, such as power grid architectures is very sensitive data and it's highly controlled. Um, and so it's very difficult to come about. But nonetheless, we think that if we can get our hands on critical infrastructure data, that these methods can show what are the critical nodes in the network and what are targets for um, malicious players such as hackers, because those are the nodes that would inflict most damage. So those are the nodes that need most reinforcement or attention to be paid to. Um, this also goes hand in hand with the next thing that we would like to look at, which is optimizing the edge removal process to generate islands as quickly as possible. Now, islands are nodes or sets of connected nodes that are not connected to some other component of the network. Um, in our study, we simply removed edges randomly, but we think that if we specify which nodes to remove in what order, in such a way that that creates islands as quickly as possible, this would lead to some very interesting research about what are the most critical components of a network. And so not only would this expand the framework that we have created here, from measuring resilience to finding critical nodes, but it'll also help engineers and researchers to define what parts of their networks need further attention to secure, as they could be primary targets to some malicious attack, or they could be crucial parts in preventing catastrophic failures during weather-related events, such as in, again, that 2003 case in Italy. Another example of a field that would greatly benefit from doing something like this would be cybersecurity, which is a very relevant field in today's day and age, especially when we talk about critical infrastructure. Lastly, we also believe that looking at other ways to perform embeddings could yield very interesting results that we can use to compare to what we have shown here, and maybe even give rise to a set of heuristics as to what type of embeddings to use for which field. Again, the original hypothesis was that using an embedding or different types of embeddings would change the way the resilience quantification process would work, or the type of results that we would get. And we have shown that in this research, but it would be interesting to figure out if different types of embeddings are more appropriate for different situations in different fields. Yeah, well, that about sums it up. So thank you everyone for your interest and for sticking around and watching the presentation.